Is this a scimitar? Let's find out. Hi friends, it's here again, and we're going to revisit a topic that's come up several times. I do a lot of help identifying various swords online, and frequently I'm asked to look at a sword that someone has purchased or that they're looking at in a movie or an art, and they ask, is this a scimitar? Now, about several years ago now, my good friend IPostSwords made a video entitled Why Scimitars Don't Exist, I believe it's called. We'll link to it below. It's a great video, and everyone should look at it. And we're going to touch on a lot of the points that he brought up. But in very short, scimitar is not a very good term for modern historians and collectors of swords to use. It's very non-specific. It's a bit of a loaded term depending on who you're talking to, but there are other terms that are used occasionally. So for instance, a term that I don't like to use is short sword. Short sword is not very descriptive, and so any time you try to define what is a short sword, you're going to fall apart because you're going to always find something that falls outside of whatever definition that you come up with. It can be used for perhaps very specific situations and scenarios. The same is going to be true whenever you're trying to define what is a scimitar. So scimitar absolutely was a historical term, and it referred to swords. But again, it begs the question, was this a scimitar? Was this a scimitar? How about a sword like this? Could this be a scimitar? What about something like, here, what's hiding back here? A katana. Would this be called a scimitar? By the end of this video, hopefully we have a better idea of what the historical use of the term was. So we're going to go over first how the word was used, both the original definition and how it was used in written sources. Then we'll talk about how scimitars were represented in art, and finally we'll go over the various types of swords. So firstly, it's worth noting that scimitar is a European term. So it's not a term native to any of the languages that the swords that it's describing come from. So just like katana is a Japanese term and is used to describe Japanese swords in many other languages, including English, which is where we're going to be discussing it here, scimitar is not used in any of the languages that of the swords that we're going to be reviewing. It first seems to show up in the medieval period in Europe. I've done a lot of digging, and the earliest reference I can find is an Italian source, and it comes from the late 14th century. And very conveniently, it actually gives a little description of it. It's talking about travelers going to Jerusalem, and it's describing an encounter with Turks there. It discusses their headwear, how they're armed, how they're armored, and it talks about a scimitar, and it says that it's belted on their side and that it's like a sword but shorter and curved and doesn't have a point. Now this is very interesting because, again, this is before the rise of the Ottoman Turks, which really happened in the middle of the 15th century, although Turks were certainly operating in the area at the time. And sabers were in use at the time, although they would have been pretty long. So for them to say that that a scimitar was shorter than a sword is a kind of unusual account. So from there, it remains in the lexicon. We see it in Italian, we see it in French, we eventually see it in Europe. It's featured in, for instance, some of Shakespeare's plays, referring to a Persian scimitar, for example. So as far back as the bard himself, it was already in use in the English language. And in that case, very specifically talking about a Persian sword, which would have looked something like this at the time. And it very much is talking about swords that are not European in the context of how do you describe what is or isn't a scimitar. Although there is a little bit of wiggle room. You can find in the Wallace collection, for example, if you go into their catalog, their online catalog, and type in scimitar, there's one or two swords that are listed as scimitars. And what are they? They are swords that were produced in Italy during the 16th century by Italian makers, and they are European swords that are done in imitation of swords that were seen in Islamic countries, so either Ottoman or Persian swords. and they are listed in the catalogs of the workshops as scimitar, so scimitar type swords, and that's how they've continued to be used in the catalog. So this absolutely was a historical term, and it continued to be a term. If we just focus, for instance, on English, it continued to be a term to refer to basically any type of, let's say, curved sword, especially shorter curved sword, referring to blades that were for countries outside of Europe, and more specifically non-Christian countries. So going back to what the original question was, would a katana have been a scimitar? Absolutely. You can find travelers that were traveling to Japan in the 18th century describing the natives of Japan carrying a 2 to 3 foot long scimitar on their hips. So this is part of the reason that we retire it. It's not a useful classification because it literally could have meant any type of curved sword that wasn't found in Europe. We already have a term for curved sword. It's saber. So these are just different types of saber. So you could say non-European saber if you wanted to, in order to describe that term. So now you know that any of the swords that we looked at the beginning could be called scimitar, although I would again really highly discourage you from using that term if you're being serious about trying to classify and describe swords, because if you just say scimitar, it really isn't going to tell anyone that you're talking about what type of a sword you're describing. Now, how were they depicted in art? We have to look at a completely different type of sword. So this sword over here is a Langesmesser produced by Langsnet Emporium. It's based on German example, but pretend for a second, instead of having a Messer style hilt, so instead of having a knife style hilt, that I have a sword style hilt, just like an arming sword. This is effectively a falchion blade. Falchions show up in Europe in the 13th century. So after single-edged swords stopped being used in the 10th century, falchions come back into use as a single-edged type of European sword in Western Europe about 300 years later. And as they start to show up in artwork, they very quickly start to be used to represent things differently than perhaps how normal swords are represented in artwork. In fact, one of the biggest mysteries of falchions is there are very few surviving falchions, even though they are way overrepresented in artwork. We may only have something like 20 or 30 surviving historical falchions, yet there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of depictions of them in the artwork that way overrepresent how often we should be seeing them surviving in the historical record. They start being seen in the hands of basically any type of villainous figure in the medieval period. So if you're talking about biblical stories, they'll be seen in the hands of the Philistines. They'll be seen in the hands of the Romans crucifying Jesus. They'll be seen in the hands of Goliath of Gath when he fights against David. But during any type of contemporary accounts also. So if the depictions are showing them going up against the Mongols, if they're going up against the Ottoman Turks, if they're going up against the Saracens during the Crusade, those warriors, especially those in the Near East, who at the time would have been wielding something not unlike this. So we haven't gotten into the history of sabers, but the Muslim world prior to the Mongol conquest would have had primarily straight swords with scattered uses of sabers. But when sabers were present, they would have had swords similar to this. So there would have been long and thin saber blades, sometimes with false edges at the back of them, among certain groups when they had incorporated detachments of Turkic peoples from Central Asia to be parts of their armies. You have Mamluk forces, you have Seljuks. They would occasionally incorporate Turkic forces in the Islamic forces that it's possible the Crusaders encountered. So you'll have these curved swords occasionally butting up against European forces in the Holy Lands. However, this is not what we see represented in European art. Instead, what you see them holding is things like this. So by the time the word falchion, or I'm sorry, rather, by the time the term scimitar is starting to be used in the 14th and 15th, or rather, yeah, the end of the 14th and into the 15th century, the term falchion, or rather, we're getting tied up today. The term scimitar starts to get married to the depictions of falchions that were being used in by the painters, by the medieval painters. So you have one term and one picture that are completely separate and are used to represent something that most of the people who were reading these descriptions and looking at these depictions in Europe would never have encountered. That doesn't mean that Europeans were unfamiliar with the idea of single-edged swords or curved swords. We have accounts from the 15th century of the famous Teutonic knights having Mongol swords in their inventory. From their inception in the 8th century and perhaps even earlier, sabers were used in Far Eastern Europe in places like Hungary, in Croatia, in Serbia. Sabers had a kind of continual trend in use all the way until they started really taking off with the popularity of the reforms in Poland and Hungary in the 16th century. So it's not as if Europe had never known about single-edged swords outside of falchions, but there is this marrying in between the two. As we get into the 15th century, you have more and more contacts from North Africa, the Ottoman Empire on the rise. We have examples of beautifully gilded and gemmed gifts to places like Portugal and Spain that use Turkish blades on hilts that in Europe would instead be called storta, or short sabers or short falchions. So there's some familiarity between the two. And so with that, we'll talk very briefly about the types of actual swords. So what are the names of all these swords that would fall under that category? Originally, as mentioned, the swords during the early parts of the medieval period, if they ever encountered non-European swords, would have been things like this. So these are the very earliest type of single-edged swords brushing into the outskirts of Europe. This is a Yuan-style saber from L.K. Chen, a so-called Mongol saber. So this is very similar to the format of the long swords and the long sabers that were in use by the nomads of the Eurasian steppe. So this type of saber enjoyed a very healthy life and would have been in use by a variety of different peoples in Eastern Europe, throughout the Middle East from the 10th through, let's say, 13th century. After the Mongol conquest, the areas that the Mongols encountered started to develop their own curved swords in addition to the straight swords that they were using. So in Persia, we had progressively more and more curvature added to the blades. The cross guards developed with longer quillons. You ended up with a more aggressively curved pommel here at the end of the grip, and you ended up with what is called shamshir in the end. So earlier on, these would have looked something like a transitional form between this and the previous Mongol sword, but they would still have been called shamshir. So again, shamshir just means sword in Persian. It is hypothesized that scimitar may be a cognate of shamshir. So the Italian scimitara may be just a corruption of the Persian word shamshir. It's unclear. So it's possible that that's the word that they were trying to say in the original Italian or French texts from the medieval period, that they were just trying to use, borrow the loan word from Persia, meaning sword, and that's how we ended up with the term scimitar in Europe. Once the Ottomans take over, we end up with a very famous shape. This is the Ottoman saber. It's called kılıç in Turkish, and it's characteristic because of this very prominent flared false edge. So while they didn't develop the false edge, these false edges actually predate the development of sabers. So even before swords started to become curved, back when they were straight, with a single edge. They still would have a false edge occasionally. They're perhaps most famous in the hands of the Turkish swords. And so the term for that is yelman, and we use that as a word wherever these false edges come up. And this is in some ways one of the more classic examples when folks, especially in pop culture and pop media, think of a scimitar. The Ottoman Empire had long-lasting influences. It reached into North Africa and in parts of Eastern Europe and continued into the beginnings of the 20th century. And this sword and a variety like it, that some were shorter, some were longer, some were wider, some were straighter. This type perhaps helped keep the general idea and shape of what a scimitar was alive. So in many regards, some might think of this as like an archetypal scimitar, this kilich. There are, again, a variety of different designs that goes through. This example is probably based on 17th century designs. And then finally, if we go all the way to China, perhaps an even more aggressive example is this dao. This is an example from the late 19th century. This is called a Niu Wei dao, or an oxtail saber. And when folks online are looking to try and replicate that kind of classic look that a scimitar has, they often land on this. Chinese swords, again, following the Mongol period, so going from the Ming through the Qing into the Republic, ended up from kind of straighter style dao, in leaning towards more saber-like dao. And while most of them have just a kind of gradual curve, during the end of the Qing and into the Republic period, these were among the more popular style. It was never a military sword, so this is more of a civilian or a militia style sword. And some of them have very wide blades. Some of them are a little bit more narrow. This one's kind of in between, but it's characterized by this big flaring tip here, and that gives it the kind of 7 voyages of Sinbad look. The big difference, though, is, of course, they almost always have this cup guard here, which is a little different than how it's usually portrayed in the media, because most of the time in media, a scimitar is portrayed as being a Near Eastern type of weapon. So again, I don't have examples of things like Indian tulwar, Arabian saif, a North African nimcha. All of these are types of sabers that would have easily fallen under the heading of scimitar once upon a time. And the term continued to be used in European media to portray any type of ne'er-do-well. We have images of pirates, for example, that use cutlasses that have the same type of long, or rather wide, broad blade, with oftentimes with clipped ends. And again, the term was sometimes interchangeable between cutlass, curtle axe, falchion, hanger, storta, scimitar. They were all used kind of interchangeably for these kind of curved, choppy blades as we get later into the late end of the 16th century and through the 17th and 18th century. So a little review about what is and isn't a scimitar. It was a historic term. It came up during the medieval period. It was used originally to describe non-European and especially non-Christian curved swords. It is not a specific term. It doesn't describe any one sword in particular. It may have originally come from the Persian shamshir, although that has not been proven. It has since been used to refer to many, many, many different types of swords. And the same sword that was used by an Ottoman Turk, like a karbela, could be called a scimitar, whereas if it was in the hands of a Polish cavalry, it would just be called a szabla. It would just be called a saber. So just based on how the sword looks does not determine if it would have been called a scimitar or not historically, which is why it's good to retire. So if you see a scimitar nowadays, the only real scimitar is probably being carried by an Uruk-hai orc. I hope that proves helpful to someone. Until next time, take care.